morning, church. Oh. I don't know why I'm running slow. I'm off work for 2 weeks, and you think I'd be rested. This is a picture of our house in Cambridge City, Indiana, with lots of snow. I thought you all needed to see that. And that's all the snow I want to see, but maybe you want to see more snow. We're supposed to have snow, I noticed on the weather, maybe Thursday, so maybe we will. I've put this water up here as an illustration. Just a simple illustration to illustrate that when I fill this glass to the top and it becomes full, that water makes up the fullness of that glass. That water is the fullness of that glass. Just an illustration, because I want to talk this morning about fullness and the cross. And there is an oft-used word in the Greek language that we find in the Scriptures that's defined as full, plerao, to fill. That's the word that's used in the Gospels when it talks about Jesus feeding the multitudes and they pick up 12 baskets full of crumbs. That's the verb that's used. And there is another verb that adds a preposition on the front of that verb, plerao, which means to fill up completely, to fill it up completely. And then you have the adjective, and then you have the noun that is defined as that which has been completed. The complement. Sometimes we might use that word complement like, my wife is my complement. She is the one that fills my life with completeness. The noun is defined sometimes as fullness, like the water is the fullness in this glass now. That of which a thing is filled, that noun is used. I like word studies, and I like to go on the trail of words as they're used in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And this is one of the words that we're looking at today. But look at this next point. Jesus was fully human. He was fully man. And there are Bible verses that present that truth. Like in John 1, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And John says, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So he was fully man, and by the way, he was full of grace and truth. John also writes in his letter of 1 John in the 4th chapter, when he talks about false teachers that were inspired by an evil spirit, so to speak, because they taught false doctrine. He says, by this you know the Spirit of God, the true Spirit. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. So John was arguing against a false doctrine that said that God didn't really come in the flesh. And that false doctrine was a prevalent false doctrine that arose in the 1st century and went on into the 2nd century. But Jesus was fully man. Philippians Paul says a similar thing in chapter 2, verse 7 of Jesus, that he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant. That's us, humans, and being made in the likeness of men. Jesus was fully man, but he was also fully God. We learn that clearly in John's Gospel in the first chapter, where he talks about the Word being God in the first 2 verses. And in then verse 14, where it says that the Word became flesh, God, fully God, became fully human. In Colossians chapter 2, as Paul is again, in that context, fighting against false teachings about Jesus, he says of Christ that in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. So picture this glass as Jesus. All the fullness in Jesus is deity. He's God. How much God is he? 100%. He's 100% man. He's 100% God. Jesus was fully man. Jesus was fully God. And then we read in the scriptures how this Greek word is used of the fulfilling of Old Testament prophecies. Like in Matthew chapter 13 when it talked about the parables of Jesus, and Matthew quotes from Isaiah and tells us that the life of Jesus fills up this prophecy that was made by Isaiah, that people would reject him. But the things which God announced beforehand by the mouth of all the prophets, the book of Acts says, that as Christ would suffer, he has thus fulfilled. Jesus fulfilled the scriptures. And Jesus fully paid for my sin debt. Paul beautifully says this in Colossians 2, where he talks about being baptized and sins being taken away at baptism. He said that at that time, Jesus made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions. Transgressions is just a synonym for sin. Transgressions means to be out of the boundary. You know, when you're playing basketball and you go over the line, the ref does what? He blows the whistle, right? Because you're a transgressor. You're going out of the bounds. And when we sin, we go out of bounds of God's law, how he wants us to live. But Jesus has made it possible for all of our transgressions to be forgiven, having canceled out the certificate of debt. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Jesus paid my debt. And he didn't make a down payment. He did not make a down payment. He made a full payment that I couldn't make myself. I have always loved the imagery that's presented in Acts 3. When Peter was preaching to an audience of Jewish people, I might as well drink this. When Jesus was preaching to an audience of Jewish people in Acts chapter 3, there in the area of the temple, and he talked about the sacrifice of Christ and the forgiveness that's available to him. And he says that in Jesus, sins may be wiped away. Wiped away. Back in the olden days when we had blackboards in school, we know what that means. Right? The teacher would write on the blackboard and she had an eraser and she could just erase that and it would be gone. That's what Jesus can do for you in the sins in your life. That's what Jesus can do with the guilt in you and the sins in your life. And that's what Jesus has done for us. He has wiped them away. And then finally, when we talked about this Greek word, full, it's used in Galatians, the 4th chapter, in a beautiful text, where Paul says that before we came to know Jesus Christ, we were in bondage. The Jews were in bondage to a law they had violated. They were sinners. And Gentiles were in bondage to sin. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Why? So that he might redeem, set us free, redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive, us Gentiles, the adoptions as sons. What a beautiful text. And what is pictured here is that when you go back in the pages of the Old Testament, you're going back in time. You can go back to the very beginning in the first verse of Genesis. And from that time on, time was created and time was going on and filling up the cup until we come to the fullness of time when God brought his Son into this world to be the sacrifice for our sins. Isn't that a beautiful text? Jesus came in the fullness of time. And then in the Lord's Supper, we come to be filled, don't we, with a sense of awe that the God of creation would show his love so sacrificially at the cross. We come filled with thanks to God for his wonderful grace and his mercy, his kindness towards us. And we come filled with songs of joy for salvation in Jesus. Be filled in the Lord's Supper.